History of the Donbass. Giuseppe Perri, CIERL, Brussels. If Ukraine is a borderland, as would suggest the etymology of its name and as shown by its position at the crossroads of peoples, civilizations and religions, the Donbass, which corresponds to the current territories of Ukrainian oblasts, provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, and also a part of the Russian province of Rostov-on-Don, is the border of the border. Today, it has become the battlefield between Russia and Ukraine, between the Western Eurasia. The Cossack heritage. The massive immigration of the late 19th century, the industrialization, the peasantry urbanization, the social unrest and anti-Jewish pogroms of the period before the 1917 revolution, have spread the idea, still alive today, of a Donbass society unstructured and violent. The harsh and unhealthy climate, hotter than Palestine in the summer and colder than the winter in St. Petersburg, affirmed in 1908 a French engineer, inadequate water supply, conflicts between Ukrainians and Russians, but without triggering ethnic violence, have always characterized the region, a particular region, in revolt against the central government. It is imperial, Soviet, Russian or Ukrainian. Donbass has, at the same time, managed to play a political role that goes beyond its borders. Two general secretaries of the Soviet Union Communist Party, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, was the son of Russian immigrants workers in the Donbass. Some of the leading politicians of the post-Soviet Ukraine are also from the Donbass, as Yanukovych, the president overthrown by the revolt of Euromaidan, or from near Dnipropetrovsk region, as Yulia Tymoshenko and the former Ukrainian president Leonid Kuchma. The fact that the political history of post-Soviet Ukraine has been dominated by people from those regions of the southeast, while the politician praised by Western regions, Chernovil, a former Soviet dissident, died in a mysterious car accident on the eve of the presidential elections of 1999, provides an important key to understanding the events of recent months in Ukraine. The region of Donbass is named after the Donets River, which ends its course in the Don. These steppes, at the eastern end of the Ukrainian space, were part of dike poles, or wildlands, that is to say regions, sparsely populated in the first centuries of the modern era, that were a transition zone between the rich Pospolita, the great Polish-Lithuanian state, the Black Sea and the Tatar Muslim world. They were, at the time, inhabited mainly by the Cossacks, peasant soldiers who had settled from the second half of the 15th century, especially to escape serfdom. The Cossacks defended these lands and in return enjoyed a certain freedom granted by Poland. They were not only warriors led by military leaders trained in the best schools, they were also the expression of the rebirth of a Ukrainian nation and a mass popular reaction against the harsh social domination imposed by the Poles. The Great Cossack Uprising of 1648, led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, whose equestrian statue is now in the upper city of Kiev, was a real war of liberation of Ukraine. The Donbass, however, was not the epicenter of the life of the Cossacks, which took place mainly in the western Dikepol's current area of industrial cities. Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk remained sparsely inhabited until the mid-19th century. The Donbass was populated primarily through the discovery and early exploitation of coal deposits. This is why the region was the first in Ukraine to meet a considerable flow of immigration from Russia. Before the second half of the 19th century, there was in fact in Ukraine almost no Russian presence. In total, in 1897, the Russians, including Russified Ukrainians or Russian speakers, accounted for 11.7% of the entire population of the Tsarist Ukraine. The imperial census of 1897 included the Donbass in Ekaterinoslav, now Dnipropetrovsk, gubernia. The Ukrainian historian Petro Lavrov estimated that the Donbass had a total of 700,000 inhabitants in 1897 and 2 million in 1920 and 7 million in 1959. In 1926, Russians constituted 31.4% of the inhabitants of the Donbass and two-thirds of them lived in cities. The Jewish presence in the Donbass has always been limited compared to other regions of Ukraine. They accounted for about 2% of the population in 1926, which were almost completely exterminated during the German occupation from 1941 to 1943, but today, they represent only 0.2%. At the time, there were a number of German rural settlements dating from the 18th century, but during the purges of the 30s and during World War II, Stalin ordered the deportation of all German communities, which have thus disappeared. Other ethnic groups, Bulgarians, Greeks, Belarusians, Poles, etc., were present in the region. Khrushchev, for example, who had emigrated when he was a child from Russia, in his memoirs recalls the skill of the Bulgarian farmers. With the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, an independent Ukrainian republic was proclaimed, but it was not recognized by the Bolsheviks who made war. The existence of an autonomous or independent Ukraine was not part of their vision, as stated in June 1917 by Bolshevik leaders of Ukraine, Georgy Pyatakov, who said that Ukraine was not an economic separate region. The Donbass industrial development had made it the imperial region with the bigger metallurgical production and mining. But in 1913, only 15% of the imperial finished industry goods were produced in Ukraine, making its economy closer to colonial exploitation. That interconnection evoked by Pyatakov. On the other hand, the status of Ukraine in Tsarist times was that of a set of imperial provinces, the southwestern provinces, ruled by a representative of the emperor and whose national identity was denied because there was talk of her as Little Russia. Ukrainian language was considered a dialect and, after the Polish uprising of 1863, its use undergoes several prohibitions. To attract nationalities that were part of the Russian Empire, and in accordance with the principle enunciated by Lenin that this empire was a prison of peoples, an ambiguous policy on nationalities, called Korenizatsiya, or indigenization, was adopted during the first decade of Soviet power, ambiguous because the aim was also to catalogue and manage the population according to a typical perspective of the colonial powers. Soviet 1924 constitution finally gives the central government more powers than expected, so that the Soviet republics have the same powers as the Russian regions. While the party was still centralized, university education continued to be given in Russian. The Ukrainian Bolshevik Party was dominated by Russians, many were from the Donbass, but Lenin rejected the creation of an autonomous republic in the Donbass. Stalin, meanwhile, favored in particular Korenizatsiya for its alliances with key local Bolsheviks, also considered the centralizing tendencies of Trotsky and his other opponents. The direction of the Ukrainian Communist Party, led by the German Emanuel Kvyring, favorable to the secession of Donbass, and by his deputy Lebed, a Russian, was hostile to Korenizatsiya. Among Ukrainian government employees who were members of the party, only 18% knew Ukrainian, only 10 to 15% of the documentation of the Ukrainian government was in Ukrainian. In 1923, a policy in favor of the Ukrainian language was then started, and in 1926, 30% of newspapers and 50% of the books published in Soviet Ukraine were published in Ukrainian. In 1927, the percentage of Ukrainians residing in Kiev was increased from 27 to 42%. The number of Ukrainian immigrants in the industrial cities of Donbass and southeastern Ukraine also increased. The Russian however, continued to be in common use in factories. For the workers, there were no mandatory Ukrainian courses because Stalin feared losing the consent of the Donbass Russian-speaking working class, and Ukrainian immigrants of the campaign accepted the domination of Russian language in factories. The percentage of industry workers that used the Ukrainian language fluently in 1929 was only 32%. The Korenizatsiya therefore represented in the Donbass cities a complex phenomenon. Russian speakers have undergone a kind of linguistic shock by Ukrainization, and part of the Russians was determined to learn Ukrainian. Many peasants and Russified Ukrainian workers entered for the first time in touch with their culture and have become aware of their own nationality. While the Russian language remained dominant and continued the Russification process of urbanized Ukrainians, this complexity explains why, even today, many people in the Donbass remain unrelated to the national and linguistic clashes. In 1928, CIERL, a Pole of Donbass, which has never learned Ukrainian, was appointed first secretary of the Ukrainian Bolshevik Party, but the most important figure was however Mykola Skripnik, a Ukrainian, who defended the independence of the republics and Ukrainization. It will be driven to suicide in 1934, when Stalin put an end to Korenizatsiya. The application to extend the Ukrainianization to many Ukrainian minority in Russia and in the Cuban, more than 8 million people according to the 1926 census, and the claim of territorial changes in favor of the Republic of Ukraine occasioned the crisis of Korenizatsiya, a crisis that was also related to the forced collectivization of the agricultural sector. The statist obsession that will have permanently weakened the peasant opposition to the Bolshevik power, to which is added a Ukrainophobia Sakharov attributed to Stalin, led to the catastrophic famine of 1932–1933 in Ukraine, December 29, 1932. The Ukrainian Politburo was forced to issue a requisition order of the reserves of wheat belonging to the families. It was the beginning of the Great Famine, which involved at least 30 million people and led to the death from 3 million to 7 million of people, according to different estimates of researchers. The Holodomor, literally death by hunger, also decimated the Luhansk region, renamed Voroshilovgrad since 1935. Donetsk region was less affected. The emigration of many Russian families in Ukraine was favored, which would alter the demographic balance in these border regions. After World War II, the Russian immigration was favored. The number of Russians present in Ukraine increased from 4 million in 1939, 12% of the population, to 7 million in 1959, 16% of the total, as now, and 21.1% in 1979. For the first time in its history, the territory of Ukraine has become binational. In the Donbass, the number of Ukrainians decreased from 65.4% in 1926 to 53.7% in 1979, while the number of Russians grew from 25.7% to 43.4%. The Russification campaign under Brezhnev had important effects in Ukraine. Periodicals published in Ukrainian representing 46% fell to 19% between 1969 and 1980, while the books have fallen from 60 to 24% between 1958 and 1980. The number of Russian-speaking Ukrainians and the number of bilingual experienced a steady growth between 1959 and 1979. In the Donbass, non-Russian-speaking Ukrainians are past about 30 to 20%. In the Donbass, the lack of university until the second half of the 60s has contributed to this phenomenon, as there was no intellectual milieu able to keep the national culture. Therefore, in the Donbass, the Russification of Ukrainians in 1979 was 5 times higher than the national average. Data are only comparable to those of the city of Kiev and Crimea. However, There is currently no region of Ukraine where Ukrainians are not the majority of the population, with the exception of the Crimea. And in 1991 all regions voted mostly for the independence of Ukraine, 54% in Crimea, always reaching higher rate than the number of residents of Ukrainian ethnicity. Thanks to the favorable vote of many Russians, in the Donetsk region 77% of people were for independence, 84% in the Luhansk and 85% in Odessa. Ukrainian 2001 census confirms that in Luhansk Oblast, the Ukrainian-speaking districts are slightly outnumbered of the Russian-speakers ones, while in the city of Luhansk and in the most densely populated districts prevail Russian speakers. The total numbers amounted to 87% of the inhabitants of the whole oblast. It was roughly the same situation in Donetsk Oblast, that is to say, in the Donbass the campaign is Ukrainian, while cities are Russian speakers. Ethnically, the situation is much more balanced. In 1989, the Russians Donbass had reached 44% of the population, but because of the return movement in Russia that affected all the former Soviet republics and mobility to the capital Kiev, the last census show that in the Donbass, the Russians now account for 38 to 39% of the population. In cities, for example in Donetsk, they represent 48.15% of the population and Ukrainians are 46.65%. Other nationalities are not very large. There are about 80,000 Greeks concentrated in Donetsk Oblast, 1.6% of the population, especially in the area of Mariupol, the industrial city facing the Sea of Azov. They were severely persecuted by Stalin during the war. There are also 60,000 Belarusians, 30,000 Tatars, 25,000 Armenians, 9,000 Jews and 8,000 Azerbaijanis. The latter two groups are present only in Donetsk Oblast. In the rest of southeastern Ukraine, these relations are changing in favor of the Ukrainian, with a larger territory inhabited by the Ukrainian-speaking citizens and a majority of the total Russian-speaking less important than the percentages of Donbass. All these data suggest that national and language issues in southeastern Ukraine are not really territorial, since we cannot strictly speak of Russian-speaking regions, or even less Russian regions, and this also applies to the Donbass, although the total percentage of Russian speakers there is very broad. This phenomenon considerably weakens not only secessionism, which already is low in itself, conducting illegal and violent actions, but also the so-called federalism. Federalism was often agitated, indeed, by the Russian authorities and their supporters to control and possibly block the process of decision-making of the Ukrainian state. It is possible to interpret this as a way to deny the Ukrainian character of the regions with a majority of Russian-speaking. As the Donbass, there are regions where the Ukrainian language, already in trouble, could succumb and disappear under the weight of a local government completely Russified. Surveys conducted annually by the Institute of Sociology of the Academy of Sciences in Kiev show that the percentage of Russian-speaking Ukrainian citizens who complain about language discrimination fell 8.6% in 1994 to 3.7% in 2012, while the number of Ukrainian-speaking who felt discriminated increased, from 6.8% to 8.4%. They are in any case minimum percentages that dramatically refute the alleged dangers of linguistic discrimination in Ukraine. A search of 2007 on the use of language, conducted by the same institute, established in Crimea and in Donbass the percentage of speakers who use only Ukrainian in privacy is 11.8%, a figure that drops to 8.6% if we refer to public use. In addition, throughout Ukraine, the percentage of those who use only Ukrainian or Sergic, a dialect mixed Ukrainian and Russian, corresponds to only 57.2% of families. If we subtract this data the use of the Sergic, Ukrainian language seems to be used only by a minority of the total population. Oversizing of the use of the Russian language is confirmed by the data on Russian mother-tongue Ukrainian citizens, which is 29% of the population, while ethnic Russians in Ukraine are about 17%. Therefore, the inherent strength of the Russian language is still very powerful. Although schools giving lessons only in Russian is in considerable decrease in Ukraine, except in the Donbass. All these data seem to show the instrumental nature of the alleged linguistic freedom attacks in Ukraine, the uniqueness of Ukrainian as the state language, adopted in 1989 by the Soviet Ukraine and confirmed by the new independent state, whose constitution also provides for the protection of the Russian language. Thus is actually a kind of positive discrimination for a disadvantaged entity, a fortiori. This applies to the Donbass. However, the 2012 Kolesnichenko-Kivalov law, wanted by the Party of Regions of Yanukovych, granted the status of regional language for each language spoken by more than 10% of the inhabitants of different regions. The Central Parliament voted to repeal this law immediately after the escape of Yanukovych, in February 2014, but the vote has not been promulgated by the acting head of state, Turchinov. It is still in force. Regarding the economy and production, Donbass, especially Donetsk Oblast, makes a significant contribution, 12.1%, in gross domestic products of Ukraine, higher than that of the regions of West. But it is a subsidized economy due to technological obsolescence of its industries and its mines, and Donetsk Oblast received in 2013 a third of all transfers from the central government to the regions, while businesses private received grants and refunds a third higher than the taxes paid. On the political front, the Donbass played an important role in the life of the independent Ukrainian state, contributing significantly to the election of President Kuchma and Yanukovych. Donbass is also the home and the center of economic activities of the richest man in Ukraine, Rinat Akhmetov, the oligarch of oligarchs, whose profits almost entirely are from the management of the coal and metallurgy of the region, privatized, but heavily subsidized by the state. A poll conducted shortly after the annexation of Crimea in March 2014 by the Pew Research Center shows that 70% of the Ukrainian population opposes the secession of the East. Even the majority of Russian-speaking is against it, 58%, while 27% of them are in favor. In contrast, 61% of citizens of the Russian Federation is now convinced that there are regions of Ukraine which belong to Russia. These data also highlight the serious responsibilities of Russian leaders who wanted to spread conflict in this very nested reality, a reality, especially, had been able to manage itself peacefully for centuries, while ensuring coexistence of all ethnic groups of the Donbass. For cons, the destabilization of Donbass led to a terrible and bloody war in the heart of Europe, a war that could turn into a protracted conflict. Giuseppe Perri, the CIERL, Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Religions and Secularism, University of Brussels, ULB.